Wonderful. Well, I think we will just begin. We're a few minutes after 1. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Duncan. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a program operations specialist here at CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy and the Evidence-Based Practice Institute. And on behalf of our team, I want to say thank you so much for being here. We're super excited for our presentation today, which is where we'll explore family-based, culturally responsive interventions for adolescent mental health care. We will start today with a land acknowledgement. CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy and the University of Washington acknowledge that we gather on Indigenous land, the traditional territory of Coast Salish peoples, and specifically the Duwamish tribe. This ancestral land is unceded and must be returned. We also acknowledge that our work across the state takes place on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region from time immemorial. Currently, there are 29 federally recognized and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within Washington state. We express our deepest respect for and gratitude toward these original and current caretakers of the region. As we move forward in advocating for and moving toward health and racial equity, let us remember that we are living in a history-driven present. Let us work to learn more about the histories, cultures, and traditions of Indigenous people and how we might build relationships with sovereign tribal nations and create more inclusive spaces that foster innovation, collaboration, and empowerment. We encourage you to consult native-land.ca to learn more about the land you are on and to pay rent through Real Rent Duwamish. The Duwamish tribe has yet to be justly compensated for their land, resources, and livelihood. And by paying real rent, you can do something to stand in solidarity with the first peoples of this land. All funds go directly to the Duwamish Tribal Services to support the revival of Duwamish culture and the vitality of the Duwamish tribe. Before we begin today, I'd like to do some brief Zoom housekeeping. So if you encounter any tech issues during the webinar or just want to express thoughts or reactions to our amazing speakers, feel free to just send us a message through the chat box. And we also, just are welcoming any sort of reactions or thoughts as well. Additionally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So we just ask that you hold your questions until that designated part of the presentation. And during Q&A, you're welcome to either pop your questions in the chat or use the raise hand function, and then we'll have you unmute to ask questions to our presenters. And for those of you who've attended our webinars before, you'll notice that we're trying out a new format today. So we wanted these webinars to feel more connected and to allow folks to have their cameras on, which we love. I know that people were already kind of connecting and seeing other folks in the room before we started today, which is great. And because of that, we also ask that you're just particularly mindful of keeping yourself muted unless you're called on by a presenter to speak. That just helps us keep the flow and keep everything running smoothly. Also, as a reminder, we will be recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to our website. At the end of the webinar, we'll send an evaluation survey link through the Zoom chat, and we would love it if you could take the time to fill it out with any feedback you have so that we can continue to improve our webinars. We'll also send out an email with that link, so if you can't do it today, you'll have the opportunity later on. We also really encourage you to share additional topics if you'd like us to focus on those in the future. Additionally, once you filled out the evaluation survey, you're eligible to receive a free certificate of completion. So this may or may not be eligible for credit through your field-specific continuing education organizations, but we're happy to provide kind of a broad certificate of completion if that's useful to you. So before I turn it over to our presenters, we're just going to take a quick look at our live poll results. So this is seeming to be a trend that we have about 68% of folks here out of 104 people who are in the mental health field, and then kind of a similar sprinkling of folks who are advocates in medical, public health, also a larger contingent of social workers. So it looks like a lot of folks who are kind of doing direct service work or engaged more broadly in public health work. Oh, great, thank you. It looks like Janet put juvenile court in the chat. And if your field was not in that poll, we would love it if you could put it in the chat as well. We want to know who's here and kind of who's represented. All right, we can go to the next slide. So again, I just want to thank you all so much for being here. We're really appreciative to have you here on this Wednesday afternoon. We at CoLab for Community and Behavioral Health Policy are just really excited to host this webinar series. As I previously mentioned, today's webinar will provide an overview of family-based interventions for adolescent mental health. And just to give kind of a brief overview of what CoLab is, we were founded in 2020 within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And our goal is really to engage community expertise and research evidence to spark creative and sustainable change in behavioral health policy and systems, particularly those involving youth and families. And we also house the Evidence-Based Practice Institute, which was established in 2007 by the Washington State Legislature to promote high-quality mental health care for kids and families. So for today's webinar, we're thrilled to feature 3 amazing presenters, and you can see their information on the screen: Elena M. Dillard, Jason Medina, and Jessica Leith. So now without further ado, I'll hand it over to our first presenter, Jessica.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks so much for having us. We're all super excited to be here, and we feel incredibly honored that you all thought of us to be able to give the important field of family and adolescent mental health justice. So thanks again. We can go to the next slide, Joanne, if that's okay. So like Anna said, my name's Jessica Leith, and I'm here with Jason Medina and Elena M. Dillard, and we have all been doing a lot of family work, and I'll let them say a little bit more about themselves as we go through. But for myself in particular, I'm super, super passionate about this work. I've been working with adolescents and families for about 15 years and kind of hit a lot of different contexts with them, from working with them in camps and case management, their community behavioral health. I still do clinical work in my private practice, and love also to be able to work with clinicians and train and do some research and teach in my capacity at Antioch University's couple and family therapy program. So trying to keep my options open for where we can really have an impact here. So what we wanted to really bring today, though, was just, we have an hour and a half. So that's, it's a good amount of time to give you an overview, but there's so much that goes into this work. So we really wanted to try to put our heads together to think about what would be most impactful for you all. Some of you may already be doing this work, and so some of it could potentially be a review, but we also, just in looking at the different types of folks here and the different type of work you're doing, some of this might be newer information. And so we wanted to try to give a little bit of information with hopefully a few practical skills that folks can leave with as well, and hopefully some excitement if you're not already excited. So we'll introduce the topic of family therapy, because I think there can be a lot of complexities when it comes to thinking about like what is actually family therapy and doing family work in addition to adolescent mental health work. Why is it important? I think, Jason and I do a lot of training together, and that's our first question. And we can usually get folks on board there, and it's everything that comes after that. It's like, yeah, but what does it look like to do the work and actually enjoy it and not get burned out? So we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges and barriers there. We'll talk about some best practice strategies for engaging in family work. We see that come up time and again in the research, that the engagement process is really the most important. Not that it's not about skills or strategies, but none of that matters if we can't get them in the room. And if we can't, there's different strategies for getting adolescents in the room and their buy-in, and there's different strategies for bringing the entire family in and really getting their buy-in for doing that together. So that's one we really like to pay a lot of attention to. And most importantly is working with families in context. So culturally responsive family work is critical to being able to do effective family work. So we want to make sure to touch base on some of the best practice strategies there and some of the challenges that might come up. Managing challenging family dynamics, that's something we hear all the time from folks, is like, I don't know what to do when there's multiple people in the room and everybody starts arguing, and then what? So that can be really intimidating and really jarring. And, I've been doing it for 15 years and that still can happen to me. So I think, don't get, don't drop out after that if that happens. And then most importantly, some self of the therapist principles, because when you're doing any type of family work, there's things that are going to come up for you. And so how do we all kind of stay in our game and not let that become a hindrance to us. So we'll all take turns addressing some of these factors. And hopefully it's something that you're all interested in. All right, we can go to the next slide, please, Joanne. So in considering some of our objectives, it'd be great to get an idea. And I thought for ease, we could just throw your responses in the chat there. But what are you looking for today? Like, what's your reason for being here? Whether it's just general interest, are there specific questions you have or things you're interested in? But we'd like to be able to make sure that it feels accommodative to some of your hopes and needs out of today. So if folks wouldn't mind taking a second and just throwing in maybe a couple of ideas about what would feel, how you could walk away feeling like you got something useful today, that'd be great. How we can help teenagers who are heightened, yes, struggling, skills for working with families. Love having more interventions, certainly. Family work skills, new ideas, how to help non-compliant teens, absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of engagement challenges. So ideas and tips for family therapy, tools, engaging families around crisis, absolutely. I did a lot of work, a lot of years in working with families in crisis, so I can certainly appreciate the challenges there. Managing multiple developmental levels of siblings, effective communication, excellent. This is all great. Understanding mental health and how to help. Yeah. So like I said, there's only so much we can cover in an hour and a half, but I do feel confident that we'll be able to give you a little bit of something that will relate to all of those pieces there. And, if you would like more additional or intensive training, just let us know. Always happy to help. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so I like to start with my statistics here just to kind of set the tone of what we are working with. And I think hopefully I'm not alone, and the others have noticed some of the trends that we're seeing lately. And I think a lot of it, of course, got attributed to the pandemic, and it certainly has been impactful. I know I've seen it in my work, but I think one of the most concerning things that happened recently was the Surgeon General's advisory report that came out in 2021. And if you haven't seen it, it's accessible. You just kind of Google it and it'll come up. There's a huge PDF file. And I think it was pretty jarring, and I've seen a lot of different webinars and talks about this from our US Surgeon General, talking through this a little bit more. And I think, the stats to me were astounding. I've done a lot of work in suicidal assessment and prevention and intervention. And we've always known it's a concern. But at the same time, some of these numbers were pretty staggering. And so I just wanted to touch base on those a little bit, just to kind of emphasize, the need here. And then we'll talk about why it relates to family work also. But when we think about where youth are at, if we looked at surveys from 2009 to 2019, there was an increase of about 40% of high school students with persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And then we also saw those who considered attempting suicide increased by 36%. Those who actually created a plan increased by 44%. So that's really concerning when we see that leap from ideation to actual behavior there. And contemplation, getting into that next stage. And you think about the teenage brain and impulsiveness there developmentally, and you have big feelings and it's hard for you to think ahead. Those are all really concerning stats. And then between 2011 and 2015, we saw youth psychiatric visits to emergency departments go up by about 28% for typical mental health challenges that you'll see among youth, from depression and anxiety and behavioral challenges. And then from 2007 to 2018, we saw suicide rates go up by about 57% for youth in that 10 to 24 year age range. And what is incredibly concerning too is that in particular subgroups and demographics, we're seeing skyrocketing rates among Black male youth and our trans youth. And so I think it's really important to think of not across, the spectrum, but also when you're working with particular groups, and why it's really important to be able to kind of get in there and assess and think about how we can keep them in the room and engage with their family around it too, because they're the ones that are going to be part of the intervention strategy. All right, let's go to the next slide. So why that relates to family mental health, because one of the things I loved about the report, not that I loved these numbers, but I really loved how they heightened the impact that the systemic impacts that it has on youth mental health challenges. And so we saw those things skyrocket. And, you know, the concerning thing is that, so this was already building before the pandemic, and then pandemic hit, and then boom, it was sort of like the icing on the cake. And so certainly wasn't the cause of it, but it certainly helped catapult it into crisis levels. And so a huge concern that we're seeing in our work, and many of you might be also seeing. And if you look at the ways that we can, you know, we've talked about protective factors a lot, and I think folks are aware of those, but there's also, this goes into intervention with them. So if we looked at the different factors that can help shape their mental health, they really took a systemic focus. And this is very integral to family therapy work, because we take a systems approach also. We don't just think about them as the individual and how we can work with them to do certain things, but we also think about, what does family look like? What's their immediate environment look like? What are the relational elements here? What does community look like? What are protective factors there? So not just self-care, but community care. What are other environmental factors affecting this? And then overall society. So we're looking at all of these pieces when we're conceptualizing and treating. And if you look at some of the many things that came up as, you know, what might be contributing to these higher rates, you know, it might just be more openness to discussing it. But we also have big things that I see teens care about a lot. Climate change comes up all the time. Racism comes up all the time. Gun violence, there are these big things that they have access to that even when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't have access to, because, you know, internet. So there's just a lot more that they're dealing with that it's hard for caregivers to be able to manage, and hard for them to be able to manage. And so it's really impacting them. And if you think about some of the things that are going into this on the right-hand side of the screen here, we look at relationships with parents, caregivers, and siblings, family mental health, financial stability, domestic violence, trauma, age, genetics, race, ethnicity, gender. All of these pieces are going into how we will intervene, and whether or not, you know, what the acuity looks like in terms of teen mental health. So I just wanted to note those, is that this really is a complex issue, and why it can be so challenging. All right, let's go to the next screen. Okay, so first, some ethical considerations, though, because I think this is one of the many challenges of doing this work. And in Washington State, hopefully most or all of you are aware that we do have the age of consent, which is 13. So it's beautiful. You know, when I was doing school-based mental health work, I mean, it was great because my teens could come to me at 13 and sign for their own treatment. They didn't need permission. And that certainly helped when they had families that weren't supportive and that didn't really want them to be involved. But you know, on the flip side of that, it can be a huge challenge at getting families inside the room. A lot of teens like to assert their autonomy over their own treatment, and this can seem like this is mine, you know, and so no, you can't be here. And I think it is a huge hurdle to try to overcome that, and to try to have them see the both and, that how do we assert your autonomy, and we can't, it's hard to change some of these things without some of the key players in the room. And so it's a fine balance we're always trying to manage there. So it can impact our access to families or caregiver. And it means we have to take that additional step of getting that release of information from them. Maintaining boundaries is another one. You know, most of us have social media policies. I think for teens in particular, they're like, hey, I'm going to be your friend on Instagram, or, you know, can I find you on TikTok? And I'm like, no, you can't. So not that I don't like you, and I'm honored and I appreciate you thinking of me, but right, we have to have these boundaries, and some of them can take that personally. So all of these different ethical considerations we're trying to teach them about, and trying to help them understand its utility and that it's not personal. And then figuring out what that looks like working with teens and what that looks like working with families. I don't treat any family the same in terms of who I see and when. Sometimes I work with the teen more than I work with them as an entire family. Sometimes I just work with them as a family. Sometimes I do like a 50-50. One week I work with the teen, the next week I work with the entire family. Sometimes I'll break them up into parenting sessions. It really just depends on what the needs of the family are. And so I'm always trying to figure out like how to tailor it for them. But that can be challenging, managing boundaries there, because when they're 13, and oftentimes in my situation, I've got the parents calling and they're setting them up for services. And then they're like, okay, well, what'd they say? What'd they do? So being really clear about like, here's what this means, here's what I can share, here's what I can't share. All of those confidentiality pieces are going to be a really important part of, and clear communication from the get-go about that. So really being clear about adolescence with, here's where I break confidentiality, and being clear with the parents around what it means to have their involvement. It doesn't mean that they have the authority to hear all of the secrets of the teens. And so those are some of the challenges that we encounter that we need to consider too. And then managing multiple households. I have a number of clients where they're going, they are going back and forth between divorced parents, and that can just bring additional challenges around who is responsible for what, and in terms of care, when I have younger kids, of course, I'm always looking at parenting plans, but it just can raise some more complexities when it comes to that. Am I talking to each parent separately? Am I addressing both of them together? So I just wanted to note that some of these things can come up, and they're just things to be aware of, and to try to feel like you have a plan early on before going into that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I do a lot of work with adolescents. Jason and I have a particular training model, and Elena has been an awesome participant in that. And so we were always very impressed with her engagement and the work she does also. And so we really just wanted to bring some ideas around things that we see useful in that training. And some of this stuff that we pulled is specifically the literature in regards to working with youth with disruptive behaviors. But we also noticed that it's across the spectrum of youth challenges, whether it's anxiety, depression, trauma, that a lot of these will, they're really relevant in any type of work that you do with them. So we try to kind of approach it from an engagement strategy and think about what it would look like to add on additional treatments from there. So they divided it up into process strategies and content strategies. And the things that come up time and again as being particularly effective are really focusing on engagement. If you look at all the family therapy models, and I know in the EBP world as well, they look at it, motivational enhancement and engagement, that really setting the tone in the very beginning, making a lot of effort to empathize with both the youth and with the families and form that alliance, build that trust. Why should you trust me, right? Especially with lots of system involvement. That is key. That is key to keeping them in there. So in that first session, we're always focusing on how do I get them coming back for that second visit, whatever your role or capacity is with the family. So that's the most important piece. And we spend a lot of time and energy talking about that. And again, that's not judging them. That's not giving them lots of problem solving strategies right away if they're not asking for it. It's just really sitting with them and understanding who they are and how they operate as a family and as an individual, what the concerns are from their perspective. And the other piece of it is that interactional focus. So it's not just me talking with the youth one-on-one and giving them homework to do, and then that's it, right? It's very much addressing everybody in the room, making sure that we're doing a lot of back and forth. If I'm getting this perspective, then at the same time, it's really fluid for me to go into the other. I'm not spending 10 minutes addressing one person and then forgetting about the other folks in the room. I think that's a really challenging part of maintaining a good balance of that dynamic and making sure it's interactional. So it's really collaborative and they feel like they are an active participant in the room and in therapy. Phasic and developmental is something that came up a lot. So when you're doing work with them, in particular, like mental health interventions, making sure that it's staged to their abilities. So meeting them where they're at. So where you have a step 1 and we don't go to step 2 until we've really mastered step 1. We don't want to overwhelm them with lots of content. We want to make sure that whatever they need in that moment, we're fully addressing, and then we can move on. I think that's a big part, and that's where you'll see a lot of dropout and attrition. The use of relational assessments also comes up. So some examples that I pointed to here were the FACEs, relationship satisfaction skills, a general one you can use, the global assessment of relational functioning. So they found that not just using, I do both. I use a lot of individual assessments, like with the, moods and feelings for both the youth and the caregivers, but I also use relational ones. Tell me more about your relationship and your satisfaction there, not just symptoms. I want to hear the both and of it. And then here and now focus. So we're working with what we've got right now. We're not diving into the past and staying there. I'm asking some questions because I want to understand how it impacts now, but I'm really focused on what's here in front of me. What's the most urgent thing coming up? What can we do right now? And that experiential focus, being able to use the time with them to the best of your ability and not just relying on what they do outside of therapy so much. And then the other piece is content strategies. So with the content, the type of most important skills I think that we see, and that I love seeing that it also comes up in the literature, is working with them on conflict resolution, no matter what the challenge. I've got a kiddo that has extreme anxiety, a 15-year-old, and yet her family's major problem is the conflict around it and managing that. So we're doing the both and there. So how do we increase family cohesion, which tends to also reduce some of those symptoms? And then communication is a big one. So how do we improve and increase some of those positive interactions around communication? So those are the two skill areas that we'll often focus on. So like I said, there's a million different areas that you could dive into, but I think what we found helpful is if we can streamline it into some particular areas that seem to be really effective, that's what we try to do. And if we're doing great and if we're having success there, then we can go into some of the other pieces of it as well. But I think the key is just not overwhelming families more than anything. Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. So I did a little bit of research because, you know, I know what I think, but I also want to do my due diligence and make sure I'm being ethical about what I am saying out here to a large audience who can also call me out on it, I'm sure. I just wanted to kind of do a run through really quickly about some of the interventions out there for, you know, these are the typical youth presentations that we'll see them and families come in for, from anxiety, depression, and behavioral challenges. And again, there's a lot of overlap. Some of the research, I saw one around anxiety, there was a review of all the different interventions, and there was a lot of group CBT that came up with parents involved. With depression, we see a lot of attachment-based family therapy. And then there's, I think it's family-focused therapy with childhood depression, but that's a little bit of a younger age group. So some can be a little relevant, might not be fully relevant to adolescents. And then with behavioral stuff, we've got a lot of those. We've got brief strategic family therapy, multi-systemic functional family therapy. We've got STAY, which is our training, and so there's a lot there that fortunately we can use. But some of the common factors that we see across the board here, so with anxiety, you know, it's not just working with them on exposure and making sure that they are using relaxation, and we're working with distortions around what is really dangerous or what's not, you know, how to reduce some reactions there, but the parental accommodation. You know, with my one client, mom is a self-proclaimed, I'm super protective. I'm probably overprotective. And luckily she admits that. But if I didn't have her involved in therapy, anything I did with her 15-year-old would be, it'd be null and void, because she would accommodate to her, because when she sees her anxiety, it perks her anxiety up. And then she wants to reduce that. Okay, let's avoid together. So there's a lot that goes into the development of these symptoms that we can point to in the environment. And that's why we really want to target that too, not just with the individual youth. Again, I can work with them on some stuff, but I need all the pieces of the puzzle. So psychoeducation can be really effective at just giving them some insight around that, using the parent as a coach and helping them to kind of reduce their own projections of anxiety. With depression, with attachment-based work, it's really focused on creating a strong, cohesive parental bond, which is something we also saw in the U.S. Surgeon General Advisory Report. They said like those strong adult bonds with youth are key. So whether it's a parent or a caregiver or somebody else in their life and some other adult, that's important. The two things that come up around depression and suicidal ideation typically are, you know, feeling like you're a burden to others. So if you're feeling a lot of criticism from folks, or a lot of shame-based type stuff, or you're feeling really disconnected, like those are two key areas that we really want to target. And so attachment work can kind of get to that. And then you can also combine it with more behavioral type stuff like behavioral activation, where you're actually like doing things that help you feel better. So it's a both and strategy there. But also we have a lot of times where like depression is a constant in the environment. There's a lot of parental depression too, you know? So again, we're working with figuring out how do we intervene in that larger context also. And the same with behavioral. I mean, if you look at BSFT and MST and FFT, they really, those are, you know, big therapies, right? They target community, they target peers, they target the individual, the family. You're talking about substance abuse, delinquency. I mean, there's a whole, like they very much are ingrained in all of these different systems, which is why they're great and really complex, but can be more difficult sometimes to implement. And so we developed STAY, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the strategies we use there that is more of like a family therapy 101. And so we're really targeting communication. We're really targeting those conflict resolution strategies, in addition to a few other things that can creep up. So they can be a little easier to manage. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to throw in a couple of examples of what it would look like when you're doing family work, especially if you're a clinician, from conceptualization, like how do you even, what is the problem basically, you know, because oftentimes we get the parents coming in and they're like, their behavior is the problem, them, you know, their lying is the problem. All of this is the youth is the problem, right? And the youth is over there rolling their eyes and they're like, you know, here we go. So we're already at an advantage there. So we're always trying to reframe that and think about like, what's the family problem here? What's the interactional problem? Is it that we want like respectful communication in general? Because I'm hearing the youth say that they want that too. Easier said than done, you know, but what does it look like to reframe this as not just individual things to work on, but also with the family? And that can be really hard. We spend a lot of time talking through how to do that in a way that doesn't get too much pushback. Goals. So now we're going into goals. Basically, we're trying to be really strategic there. And then with treatment too, we're thinking about not just individual treatment strategies with the youth, but we're also thinking about like how to work with the entire family system to really have some sustainable effectiveness there. So if we go to the next slide, I've got an example of an actual client that kind of demonstrates this. So for example, I always like to do part of working in context and doing that full family systems perspective is thinking about all the different factors that are contributing to this presenting problem of depression and suicidal ideation with Raina. So, you know, I've got a 14-year-old, she's, you know, Southeast Asian. I didn't want to be too detailed for confidentiality, plus Eastern European, bisexual, middle class, no Indigenous heritage, born in Southeast Asia, moved here a little later, dual citizenship, identifies as female or assigned female at birth. And so all of these factors literally go into her depression and suicidal ideation. And it took me several months for me to find out that actually the main reason is the racism that she experiences. That wasn't something that she told me for several months. And so I easily would have gone in and just targeted depression. I would have just gone in and, okay, what are the things that make you happy? How can we do more of that? How can we work with mindfulness? You know, all of these strategies that I know. But until I brought in mom, until I brought in dad, who was also the perpetrator of a lot of microaggressions, a lot of shame-based behavior at home, mom's avoidance around it because there was a lot of family conflict with her and dad. I mean, it was just all over the place, right? So we're talking about targeting multiple areas there. And I kept being like, why is the depression not going down? You know, why are we still having this? And I didn't really have any impact until I had everybody in the room, everybody part of it. And I had to build a lot of trust, a lot of buy-in, but ultimately I was working at doing individual work with Raina by working through some ethnic identity development so that she could feel some great self-worth and security around that, and then increasing positive interactions with her family in order to reduce conflict among everybody, distress tolerance skills. So I could kind of weave it all in there. So that just gives you sort of, I know it's a very brief example, but just kind of an idea of what how you can pull in those family elements there. Okay, next slide. I did it. Okay. was so worried about timing. So I thought that was my last one. So I know that that was a very like quick version, but Jason's gonna walk you through a lot more where to go like in the weeds a little bit around some of that. And we're happy to answer questions later on about any of the other stuff.
Thanks. My name is Jason Medina. I'm a child and family mental health specialist. I have a small practice in Greenwood. I've been working with Jess for almost 10 years on developing the STAY protocol for working with families. I'm also formerly an MST therapist and an FFT therapist, and I've been working with child welfare and juvenile justice as a consultant for the last almost 20 years. So first thing out of the gate is I want to acknowledge how much information Jess just packed into a really short period of time. And I think, our goal was to really provide you all with as much context as possible, particularly around this idea of why youth work is family work. And you see on your screen is this idea of the STAY philosophy, and I want to invite all of you, and I saw it in the chat, several people mentioning wanting tools and wanting a real clear directive for working with families and how to engage people. And I think before we really even jump into what to do in the room, the question that we have to answer is why we're doing it, and to understand not only how to get into a family and like Jess said, get in the weeds with them, but really, for yourself is having your own philosophical foundation for why you're doing this work. One of the things that we touched on right out of the gate is this idea of youth work is family work, and the why is really important. Jess indicated this through several different slides, that the data all suggests that the things that young people struggle with in their lives largely begin at home, and they're perpetuated at home. And we're going through a very difficult transition, especially with adolescents, from that period of their lives where they're largely dependent on their parents, not just for food and shelter, but also for their emotional well-being, for their understanding of their worldview. And that's coupled with this transitional period where they're starting to look to their peers. I read some pop psychology article a few weeks ago talking about how children around the age of 14 literally stop hearing their mother's voices. They filter it out. And I got a kick out of it. And just in any of you who have teenagers probably experience this on the daily, that they're looking to other voices for their influence. They're looking to their peer group. They're looking to other respected adults to help inform their worldview, because so much of that foundation has already been laid with their parents. And as we make that awkward transition from completely dependent to really looking to these other places for information, we as I'm saying we as young people are left to struggle and try to make sense of the world. And as a therapist, right, having peers over parents, exactly, having young people in the office one-on-one, I find that's one of the easiest ways to work, is to choose to work individually with young people, to garner their trust, to work with them over time. But in those opportunities, we also give up a lot of context, right? And a lot of the context in where young people struggle is in conflict management, in emotion regulation, in problem solving skills, in communication, in attachment or bonding. Like all of these things begin and sometimes end at home. And so when we say youth work is family work, that's a core part of our philosophy. And that's not to say there isn't value in working individually with young people, because there absolutely is, especially as they make that transition into more independence and more looking to their peer group for identity. And if you have the opportunity to invite parents in, and Jess laid out some really nice ways that you can blend the two together, individual and family work, with transparency as a core part of that process, with trust being the foundation, because you're really working in some gray areas. You have an opportunity to affect change on a much larger scale, because you're not just working with the individual around their problems, whether it's managing anxiety or depression or a myriad of other issues, but you're working in the context in which those problems occur or are subsequently perpetuated. I hope that makes sense to everybody, the kind of why we do what we do. In the STAY model, we spent a lot of time talking about what our philosophy is in working with families and working with young people. And the foundation of change does not happen on, we don't build a house on a weak foundation. We build a house on a strong foundation, on concrete and stone. And so when we start to think about change processes with young people, when we start to think about change processes with families, we look to what they do well and build on those strengths. And anyone who's interested in the STAY training, we can give you really concrete examples if you join us. And so when young people come into the office, when families come into the office, immediately right out of the gate, I'm thinking about what really makes these people unique, what really makes these people successful in the world. And sometimes that means reframing some really challenging or difficult behaviors. But it also allows us the opportunity to leverage some of those, what other people might perceive as problems, to leverage those as skills. They're adaptive skills that young people have learned, whether it's with their families or that families have learned with each other. And then we can then parlay those challenging behaviors into changes that are sustainable for everyone in the system. We believe that the onus is on the clinician to adapt and adjust to the unique needs of the family. This may be challenging for some of you who believe that, that you are the expert and that the family is coming to you for help, and therefore, they may be coming into your office. Some of you may be doing community-based work, which really right out of the gate, you already are going into someone's home, so you know that you have to adjust to being in someone else's environment. And that's actually, I think, a really nice place to start. But when people come into your office or people come into your clinic, we've taken the approach that the onus is on us to meet the needs of every unique system. And that can be done behaviorally, by either changing the way you talk or how you present yourself to make other people feel comfortable. If I'm kind of my over the top, really grandiose, large self, and a family comes in and they're very soft-spoken and quiet, I'm going to overwhelm them really quickly. And so it's not a big deal for me to just tone it down a little bit and just meet people right where they are, rather than asking them to come up to where I am. And the same is true, is that sometimes when I get a really big dynamic family, if I can meet them where they are and just speak their language, so to speak, trust begins to build, a bond begins to build, a sense of familiarity begins to build very quickly. Also, we know that a lot of the families, especially those of you who do work in juvenile justice or in the court systems, or those of you who are working in community mental health systems, where families are referred by outside entities, we know that people feel overwhelmed, people feel like they're failing, people feel like they're struggling. And so the onus is on us to find ways that people are succeeding, to celebrate failures, to celebrate successes. Failures are attempts at successes. We just have to try a few more times. And so the onus is on us to identify what people are doing well and hype them up for it. Difference is a huge deal in the work we do. We're dealing with people of different genders, ages, cultures, ethnicities, religious backgrounds, developmental needs, all kinds of things all the time. And so rather than being overwhelmed or frustrated or fearful of difference, we really encourage embracing difference by being curious, asking questions, right? Like find out more. If you don't understand something, ask. And all of us who work with young people know that they can tell when you're lying. They can tell when you're faking it. They can tell when you're, just kind of being performative. And so be genuine, be curious. And if you don't know, ask. It affords an opportunity, one, to make your client an expert, and two, to give that sense of connection that otherwise might feel like isolation. We know that change doesn't necessarily come just from insight. Otherwise, all of us would, none of us would eat junk food, and there'd be no smokers in the world, and they wouldn't have to put those labels on alcohol about not drinking it while you're pregnant. That change is really kind of complicated for each of us individually. And so we know when people are hopeful, they're more likely to follow through with your suggestions. And so we encourage you to leverage hope by being strength-based, to leverage hope by being curious about difference, to leverage hope by being someone that the family doesn't expect, by being unique. That when people are hopeful, they show up to meetings. When people are hopeful, they try things that they might not otherwise try. A little bit of structure goes a long way to alleviating people's anxiety. One of the big things about the STAY model is that we offer you a plan. And so for those of you who are going out working with families, try not to wing it. Try to have a plan. Try to have goals for your sessions. Try to have practical skills that you're going to use in session, rather than just kind of making it up as you're going along and coming in with a family and sitting down and saying, hey, how are you guys doing today? So what's on your mind? Have a plan. Have a series of activities that you're going to do with the family in session, so that they walk away feeling like they have something tangible and practical to work on. And that combination of both insight and practical skills yields what we think are changes that are sustainable. Okay, Joanne, next slide, please. As I said, working with young people individually is one of the things I treasure the most. It's fun, it's interesting, it gives me an insight into a world that is not my own. And I've always enjoyed it. And the older I get, the more I enjoy it, because there's so many cultural differences between young people now and myself. And yet, it can be really challenging, not just to engage young people, because sometimes the culture is so different, but particularly to engage families. There's logistical challenges, there are cultural challenges, there are a myriad of different things that get in the way. One thing for therapists is that a lot of us can be overwhelmed by the complexity of sitting in a room full of people and dealing with conflict and dealing with intensity. That the therapist doesn't feel like they have the tools or they have the skills, or they, for those of you, I saw a couple of interns in the group, that you may be still in school or just coming out of school, and you don't feel like, we didn't talk about this. We talked about helping skills. We talked about being active listeners. We didn't talk about, what happens when people start screaming or throwing things at each other, or storming out of the room, or pointing the finger and, saying obscene things. And so because people can get overwhelmed, because we also we all grew up in an environment, and we all grew up with a sense of family, your caregivers or your parents or your grandparents or your foster parents, whomever you grew up with, maybe you grew up in a group home. In that environment, you learned what it means to be a part of a family system of some sort. And subsequently, we all have buttons that get pushed when we sit down with families. And if you don't have a good supervision group, if you don't have a good consultant or supervisor who you can go to, it can be really overwhelming to do this work. Anyone who's taken the STAY training knows I advocate very intensely for consultation and supervision when you're working in this field in general, but particularly when you're working with young people, and particularly when you're working with families, so that you can make sure that you're very clear about what are your issues, and then attend very directly to the needs of the family. And then we have, a lot of struggle getting parents to show up. There can be, when by the time kids are 14, 15 years old, parents have you fix it. I broke it, you fix it. Or just they're overwhelmed, they're tired, they're exhausted. They're probably not just one issue that they're dealing with. Maybe it's a single parent dealing with work-related issues. Maybe you have a grandparent who really never signed up for this in the first place. Maybe you have a caregiver who had no idea what they were getting into. And from the outside, as a therapist or a clinician or social worker, you might see that person is unwilling. And I just generally see someone who's overwhelmed and needs motivation as to why there's value in them participating. Go ahead on to the next slide. So there's two more things I really want to speak to, and I'm going to try to do it as quickly as humanly possible. One is, what do you do in the room? And a lot of you asked for tools. Very quickly, right out of the gate, pay attention to the process, right? Pay attention to the interpersonal processes that are happening in the room. Rather than what they're saying or getting stuck or caught on the words, pay attention to what they're doing. Watch body language, make those observations part of your intervention. I'll speak to that more in a second. Make sure, as Jess said, you keep the ball moving around the room. You get multiple perspectives. That doesn't mean everyone speaks equally, but it means making sure that you hear enough from the young person or young people, enough from the parents that you get a sense of where they're coming from. Validation or acknowledgement does not necessarily mean you agree, right? And in fact, I like to say a lot of times, focus on acknowledging, acknowledge what the person's saying, acknowledge what you're hearing. It doesn't mean you agree with them. It means you're trying the best you can to understand where they're coming from, and to help these folks who are struggling to communicate, who are struggling to problem solve, who are feeling hopeless, who are feeling disconnected from one another. By sitting there and acknowledging their experience, you're giving them a bond or a connection with you, and you're also offering them a way to connect with each other. You can model what you would like the young person or the caregivers to learn. You can take a deep breath. Hey, wait, can we slow this conversation down a little bit? I'm just getting overwhelmed. I need a sec, right? Little things like that can really help facilitate communication in a session that gives them a sense of what it looks like to breathe, slow down, self-soothe. Hey, I'm going to go take a walk for a minute. Anybody else want a break? Doing things like that. These are interventions. You can be really strategic about what it looks like to keep calm when things escalate, what it looks like to communicate effectively, what it looks like to manage your emotions, what it looks like to work through a problem-solving technique right in front of the family. Conflict is part of the process, and a lot of families live in heightened conflict all the time. It is not your job to go in and shut them down or tell them what they're doing is wrong. Our job is to meet people where they're at and help them to be more effective at getting their needs met. And that means, if you came in to any number of families and told them that they're not going to talk loud, or they're not going to use the curse words while you're there, you're going to lose them immediately. So you have an opportunity to meet people where they're at, to help them learn to manage their emotions in a different way. But you can't do that if they don't show up. All right, one more. So here's kind of like a quick 4 A's of what to do in the room with families. 1, stay active. Try not to take a passive approach to family-based interventions. I know a lot of us learned in school that we should be listening and that we should be active listeners and all of this stuff. I don't know. I'm the type of person that when I'm doing family work, when I'm working with young people, I don't want to be a passive listener. I don't want to sit across from my clients and stare at them and wait for them to talk to me. I like to go in with an agenda. I like to go in with a series of questions. It helps me feel more at ease if I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I'm a coach that likes to sit at the end of the bench and get involved and be really, I'm going to talk about de-escalation right now. So one is being really active from the onset, and they get used to hearing your voice right out of the gate, right? You're jumping in, you're getting involved. Hang on, let's slow down for a second, right? Acknowledge the person who is talking. If you have one person who's really holding the negativity for the system as a whole, whether it's a parent or a young person or a caregiver, make sure that you go toward that negativity. Don't shy away from it. Don't shut it down. You sound really overwhelmed. You sound frustrated. You sound sad, hurt, hopeless, angry, whatever the thing is, right? And going towards that person and acknowledge what you think that they're experiencing. It offers one, it garners you a tremendous amount of credibility that you're willing to be confrontational in a way that's supportive. It also garners a ton of trust with the family, which is ultimately when we do start implementing changes down the road, they need to trust you in order to follow through with what you're suggesting. So acknowledge the person who's talking, stay active in the room, right? Attend to what is going on. This is the process, right? Versus the content. Attend to the behaviors, observe what you see. Hey, I noticed that every time we mention school, Junior, you kind of slouch down in your chair and start staring at the floor. And Dad, I see you get your back really straight and your volume goes up. Is this kind of what happens every time you guys have a conflict? Dad, you get loud, and kid, you shut down, or the other way around, right? That's a really nice way to stay active and engaged in the conversation and observe the behaviors. It also creates a focus on the relationship, a focus on the way they're communicating with each other, rather than blaming, hey, Dad, I need you to calm down a little bit, or hey, kid, you need to sit up and look at me and talk when we're at, right? Because doing that can shut people down, can make them feel disregarded or disrespected. Instead, is just observe the behaviors and let it sit for a minute. It goes a long way being comfortable with uncomfortable silences in working with families. And then another thing that you can do when you're in those high conflict situations or things are getting intense, you can just observe their strengths, right? Just, wow, you guys are really passionate. Wow, you're really thoughtful people. Man, this is a dynamic group. I know I don't have to guess what you're thinking. Man, you guys are really honest with each other, right? Just shelling them off. These are their strengths. This is what you see they're doing with each other, right? And then if you feel like you've got a little bit of credibility and a little bit of momentum going on, you can observe their behavior in a way that reframes it or relabels it, right? It's like, wow, Dad, it seems like you get so overwhelmed or angry about school because you're really worried about your child not succeeding, or you really want your child to have it better than you had, or kiddo, it seems like your silence is really about not wanting to fight anymore. Am I getting that right? Do I have that sense that the reason you slouch down in your chair is because you just want the fighting to stop? Oh, I get that. That's where you're coming from, because they have their own narrative. So you're offering a different narrative. You're offering an alternative to the way that they think about each other and the way they experience each other, right? So stay active, acknowledge what's going on in the room, attend to the behaviors rather than what they're saying, and offer some alternative meanings to what you're observing that are strength-based, that are about the relationships that you see playing out in the room in front of you. That was fast. Okay. Next slide. Take it away, Lena.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, of course, for being here. Jason and Jessica, it is such a pleasure to facilitate and to lead this conversation with you all. I've been in a lot of spaces with you too, and absolutely, you are spot on, appropriate, and what we would say is culturally responsive to really responding to the subculture of working with adolescents. So again, I'm just excited to be here with you all, and thank you guests for attending. Again, as mentioned, my name is Elena M. Dillard. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist. I've worked in a variety of settings with adolescents, from psychiatric units to outpatient to community mental health to residential to school-based work, which I do now with our youth crisis response, a bunch of different settings really to understand and work with our population. And I really like what Jason said. That reminds me of our why. I just want to put that out there, re-emphasize our why. Why do we work with young people? Why do we work with adolescents? Why is that something that we are so passionate about? And I'm very clear about what my why is and how I came to this work over 10 years ago. And so I'm just really excited to be here and share on cultural considerations for working with family-based adolescent work. So what is culture? We're only really going to get a chance to scratch the surface, as my colleagues have done so well already, to really understand culture to the depth and to the brevity of how does it, it's necessary and important that we bring it into the context of our family work. And I also want to introduce the terminology of cultural sensitivity, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. I know we've heard often in our field about cultural competence, and that essentially refers to having been arrived at a particular fixed place of culture and understanding. And so let's bring in the narrative and the terminology of cultural sensitivity, cultural responsiveness, which is essentially on a continuum. It evokes and transcends generations, and it evolves. So even understanding our own culture and how places that we associate ourselves with or identify is certainly on a continuum. And I'll talk in a minute about the multicultural counseling and therapy. Again, another framework and approach to working culturally in context to our families and the people sitting in front of us. So again, culture, what is it? Well, a basic definition by Merriam Dictionary says cultural belief or customary beliefs, social norms, and material traits of religious and faith social organizations, a set of shared values, goals, and practices that characterizes a particular group, institution, or organization. These are features of people in time, space, and geographical orientation in an area. It's essentially integrated patterns of knowledge and exchange between transmission of knowledge information across generations. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, if you were to ask the anthropologist, culture would be defined as a set of implicit and explicit values, ideas, concepts, and rules of behavior that allow a social group to function and perpetuate itself. A social group to function and perpetuate itself. That's what anthropologists would say. And sociologists would describe culture as a large and diverse set of mostly intangible aspects of social life, including, but certainly not limited to, values, beliefs, symbols, language, communication, and practices defined as a collective. So in essence, culture is what makes human life meaningful. We are all a part of a culture, subcultures, as my colleagues have already talked about, the layers of an individual culture, our family culture, our school culture, community, environmental, and ultimately systemic. So putting into context both the ADDRESSING that Jessica mentioned earlier, the addressing of culture and kind of the demographic census stuff we know, but also the subcultures within those cultures is certainly on a continuum. So being mindful of what really culture is, and again, how it lends itself to being brought into the room. As Jessica mentioned earlier, no family is the same, no individual the same, no teenager is the same. So really taking into context that which the youth is bringing in, as well as ourselves, which I'll speak to in a minute. So nextly, just again, responding to MCT, multicultural counseling and therapy. This is a therapy and an approach that seeks to embrace the highly varied social context in which individuals reside in. It's an approach that balances both the individualistic and the collective realities that surround an individual, their families, significant others, communities, environments, et cetera. And again, this model does take that into active consideration when you're doing your assessment process, when you're diagnosing, and ultimately when you're treating your client and the family in front of you. Again, lived experiences and their cultural identities and its relation to the goals that you have set forth. All of that is being considered from the onset. Like Jason mentioned, the engagement piece through the graduation and the graduation and the closing of their file. All of that is active in the process when it comes to culture and being included. Taking it back a little bit, just understanding cultural responsiveness, I wanted to make mention of many of our graduate training programs. Many of our graduate training programs are based upon Euro-American kind of Western philosophies, Western ideas and structures on how to do individual work and how to address mental health. And our trainings often that we've received, likely I would imagine for many of us on the line, are culturally bound bias, meaning that they inherently have blind spots in them, which usually excludes the extensiveness and the expansiveness of culture. And so one of the things I want to invite us to do and to consider in our work this afternoon and moving forward is consider other forms of mental health, other forms of healing, other forms of treatment outside of the mainstream ideas of abnormal, normal, typical, atypical, which is what a lot of our Western philosophies and trainings formulate in the framework of how do we do this thing called therapy. That would include, as mentioned, storytelling in the arts, music, dance, movement, drumming, chanting, singing, again, movement. Those interventions and those kind of frameworks of how do we work with clients, particular adolescents, when they're in, again, that transitional stage of not being a child and not transitioning to young adulthood, is based upon the spiritual plane of human existence. Again, a lot of our training programs and our graduate programs, I adore, and my beloved graduate programs, certainly, but it is based on the physical plane, the five senses, the thing you can see, the things that you can experience live with your five senses. But when we talk about culture, be willing to step outside of what we maybe have been indoctrinated or trained to understand or conceptualize when it comes to working with families of color, and certainly adolescents in that way, a more holistic approach of a treatment that's based on spirituality, ancestral, indigenous community healing practices that extend beyond what we may have learned in our good old DSM, right? And so these two things, and we'll have a case study in a moment that talks about the importance of bringing in, again, the family and the culture of the individual to really address the same and similar symptomology that we would categorically consider to be anxiety, depression, or trauma, or something of that nature. So with that, interestingly, throughout the research and what I found, I came across an article in 2009 that says the psychological research that informs the knowledge base of our profession. So the information that we use to then inform our work and how do we move forward constitutes only 5% of the world's population. So what that means is that there is 95% of our population that is excluded from the context, excluded from the conversation, essentially, that then lends itself to inadequately serving our humanity as a collective. So keeping that in mind, information is great, research, science, all of that, but we are certainly still needing to make some active efforts to include culture actively in our research that is attended to one's individual groups and clusters of folks, from Black and Brown, Indigenous, to the array of cultural diversities that we experience here, that we as humans have in our own existence, being less monocultural and ethnocentric, right? Multicultural, multisystemic. That's really that's what and where we want to be when it comes to working with families and those cultural considerations for the work that we do. So what is adolescent culture? My colleagues talked about it earlier. They talked about that specific place where they are not yet they're no longer children, and they're not yet full adults or cross the threshold of 18 or 21, whatever really that means. They're in that stage of identity, who they are, and in relation to who they are and their peers amongst them in their own circle. So according to psychologist Erik Erikson, right, and he talks about his stage of development, he defines adolescenthood as kids or young people between the ages of 12 and 18 that are looking to find themselves within and outside their cross and intersectionality of their own culture. And by doing this, they are finding or becoming lost. They can find themselves or become lost in who they are because they are still figuring out of who they are, right? So their context, their two environments that they are in, which my colleagues mentioned earlier, is school. So peer relationships, peers and people in their social circle, as well as home. And we know that when our sense of stability and our sense of identity is secure, it leads to a more stable and emotional well-being. So adolescenthood has a subculture that is holding and compounding the weight of them figuring out who they are in themselves and in their relation to their peers, and ultimately in the world, as well as holding the duality of trying to uphold the responsibilities of being a child, being a student, being a friend, being a daughter or a son, and how to hold both of those at the same time. So our adolescents are in that time period. And I'm sure all of us can remember a time or two in our own adolescence where we were having some internal conflict and grappling with who are we like our peers or not, or like our friends, like our families or not. So adolescenthood very much has its own subculture. Adolescents at the same time too, particularly the adolescents now, if we really look at being in 2022, these Gen Z, the middle cluster of Gen Z, these are adolescents that were born between the years of 2004 and 2009. 2004, 2009. This is during the height and the boom of the internet. This is the official launch period of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. If we can imagine, it was actually the first, that cluster of time was the first debut of the Apple's first iPhone. Like, can we even think back to that far? It was the years of saying goodbye to our beloved floppy disks and our hello USB drives, right? So this time period where our current adolescents are, they woke up to technology. They were born into technology. It was the year of the first sworn in presidency, the 41st president, Barack Obama, and the list goes on. So culture for the subculture in and of itself, and then the subculture of adolescenthood is very pertinent to us ensuring that we're taking that into context and we're considering that when we're looking at treatment plans or working with families or the type of interventions that we do, being aware of what their world is, what's happening right now in their world, whether it be, trends on social media or whatever. And so again, as providers and as clinicians, being willing to step out of what we may think as adults of what should be happening or needs to be happening, and going back to stepping into their shoes of the world that they are in as a subculture of being an adolescent and a teenager. Now, those two environments, again, as I mentioned, school and home. There's a quote I have on here, and it will lead kind of into the next conversation about, again, circling back to the family-based work and why it's so important, is by psychotherapist Kathleen Smith. She says that stress trickles down, and anything that impacts a family can affect the teen. I would actually lend to say that anything that impacts a family will impact the teen. Again, my colleagues already spoke to the overlay of systems as well as what the youth is experiencing and what seems important to them, both in the social setting, setting number one environmentally where kids are, social and school, as well as the home setting. Again, this psychosocial stage of influences of peers, social trends, pop culture, schoolmates, friends, and family is all being filtered to them as who am I in it? How am I similar? And how am I different? Again, that's why family-based work is so important, it's so critical, taking into cultural considerations, cultural context of what's happening for the teen. I like what Jason said. He talked about meeting them where they are. And a lot of times that means sometimes making ourselves uncomfortable. What we, especially when working with adults or a different set of populations, a different subgroup, we can get a little apprehensive and not want to get in there and really like Jason said, lean into the conflict, lean into what's happening before you with all the people in the room. So meeting them where they are, both in the home setting and in the school setting, certainly in the room, because these are both relevant and necessary places for us to make meaningful change. It needs to be woven, it should be woven into the fabric of our care when we're addressing family work, when we're addressing our adolescents, keeping that certainly into context. It's not a nice to do, it's not a, oh, let's just throw it on the end. It's what Jessica said, being strategic and relevant, using our clinical judgment of why we're bringing a family in, when, how, taking dyads, slicing the structure, right? So taking a kid and one parent or both parents do more parent stuff, or both of the teen siblings, or two siblings and a parent, like creating those configurations. It's very strategic. It's not an add-on. It's not an afterthought. With that, I wanted to throw in another thing that I thought was very interesting. In 2018, the APA revealed, similarly on that last notion from psychotherapist Kathleen Smith, the APA said that they revealed that family discord and pressures of unrealistic home and school expectations, such as parentification, sibling conflict, illness, financial, and all of these things can spike the stress that is placed on teens. In addition, like I mentioned, the inundated perpetuation of social media. Social media, it's as much as we can be connected, we can be so disconnected. So our teens, again, between 2004 and 2009 right now, what they're facing, these handheld things in their hands also very much plays a role in the work that we do. So again, keeping that into context when we're working with our youth in a school setting, a home setting, and the unrealistic expectations that they're holding at the same time while trying to figure it out. 14, 15 years, 16 years on life is not a long time. It's a long time, but it's not a long time. So they certainly need a lot of space to be able to figure it out and to navigate. And that's what our roles are as social service providers, case managers, therapists, clinicians, to work with our kids in that way. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you. So we're just going to jump into a case example. This is Joy. Joy is a 15-year-old. She's been working with Dr. Spencer, a psychotherapist, for the last year and a half. She came in for treatment because she had experienced a sexual assault by a classmate. And then about a month ago, her great aunt died and passed away because of lung cancer. Joy then reports that she is experiencing and thinking about death a lot more than she used to, and she has frequent nightmares. She kind of just says these nightmares create a lot of sense of terror for her even after she wakes up. With that, Joy has lost notably 10 pounds because she hasn't felt like eating. And for the last week or so, she's had increased levels of anxiety and feeling weak in her body. In the last few weeks, Joy also experiences, and what she reported to Dr. Spencer, as daily dizzy spells. So this is a live case example. And listening to that, what do we think in our minds? What conceptualization? Feel free to put it in the chat if you feel comfortable doing that. What do we think is going on with Joy right now? What diagnosis might we be considering, or what clusters or features of symptomology of diagnoses might we be thinking? This is Joy, 15-year-old. She's been losing weight. She reports being weak, increased anxiety. She had a death recently. She had experienced a physical sexual violation and reporting dizzy spells. Dizzy spells. Okay. Yeah, trauma. I see it. Absolutely. Depression, PTSD. I see a lot of that. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Absolutely. Maybe some anxiety, maybe MDD, severe episodic, maybe. Yeah. Grief and loss, certainly. Okay, so what Dr. Spencer chose to do in this case in her treatment, yeah, MDD, excellent, thank you, is she encouraged Joy to go to her PCP, go to her physical doctor. Maybe there's some other explanation of why you're experiencing things getting weak and dizzy spells and these types of things. This was a live case, no physical explanation of those symptoms. Her PCP basically gave her a clean bill of health. So Dr. Spencer goes back to her training, which I talked about earlier, is highly monocultural, and it's monolithic, and it's one way. And she says, okay, Joy, let's understand these symptoms a little bit more. When do you think these started? How did it happen? What do you think is causing it? And still Joy was like, I don't know. I don't know. So let's move on. Go ahead, Joanne, to the next slide. Awesome. So Joanne's mom, after finally Joy is like, I'm just going to talk to my mom about this. Her mom and Joy are Navajo Nation. Joy's experiencing what that culture calls as ghost sickness. With the urging of her mom, Joy goes back to her tribal community with her mom and begins rituals and ceremonies to respond to the sickness. They seek guidance from spiritual leaders, tribal members who perform sacred rituals to, again, allow her great aunt's spirit to find peace and the symptoms Joy has been experiencing to subside. So this case example is really just addressing, it brings everything together that we've been talking about this afternoon, about the individual, the culture, and the family, right? We would have been doing some other conceptualization and some other treatment plan if we solely relied just on some of the diagnoses that we threw out: MDD, PTSD, trauma, grief. All of that is valid in its own way, but let's again consider how culture is playing into what we are even seeing and what we even interpret as what we're seeing. Ghost sickness, something of the Navajo Native Indigenous people, that makes sense in their culture, and that's what their beliefs are from there. So let's move along. There's a lot of things that we've gotten to today. And so we're gonna just keep our conversation going. Appreciate y'all hanging with us. Jason mentioned it earlier, and this is what I'm just gonna speak to this, is adolescent strengths and contributions. Thinking about what adolescents have brought to the table and continue to bring to the table, we want to bring that into the room. We want to enhance, we wanna cultivate, we wanna foster, we wanna support and celebrate that. throughout our history, in fact, it's a lot of our teens who have made some declarations, who have made history. Anne Frank, the 13-year-old Jewish girl, and her diary. Claudette Colvin, she was actually the first girl before Rosa Parks. Many of us know Rosa Parks and her story and her legacy to our culture in the civil rights movement. But Claudette was a 15-year-old girl who actually refused to give up her seat to a white woman on a segregated bus before that. But because she was a teen, society didn't want to see, her be on the front tabloids, and there's a lot of other things behind that. But she was 15 and she made a declarative statement. Even Louise Braille, who was a 15-year-old who created Braille, how we read for our sight and, blind and hard to see sight impaired persons, on how they communicate with us. That was established by a 15-year-old kid. And so our teenagers are not our future leaders. Our teenagers are our current leaders. And so when we can frame and shift our paradigm to not working with teens, but serving our teens, I know that we're going to have some different outcomes when it relates to building trust and connection and attachment and relationship and safety with teenagers as they are going through the things that they are going through. And we adults have an opportunity to speak into that. Goes back to engagement. With that engagement, even sitting, how we position ourselves, even sitting side by side, or as case manager, I know when I used to be on the field, it was like a kid being in the sea and we're driving to DSHS office or to school or anything else, side by side, walking, doing some like, hey, let's go take a walk, walking side by side rather than front to front. Even our position in the room can help teens feel more comfortable, again, building that safety and that trust as well. I like this quote by Dr. Janet Edgett. She says, because teens in these stages defined by Erikson, they are most protective of their vulnerable sense of dignity and particularly unforgiving of adults who seem to talk down to them, attempt to take advantage of them, or verbally one-up them. So our teens, again, are bringing a lot of things to the table. And when we posture ourselves a little differently, change our perspective, change our paradigm, and know that they are in this stage, they are holding their dignity and their identity very close to them. If we can meet them there, again, giving them agency and autonomy in the room, that is what's helpful. That is what, again, cultivates that engagement, that solid engagement piece that then lends itself to therapeutic alliance and rapport building. That quote at the bottom says, the basic yearning for authentic connection with the provider transcends racial categories. So, right, we were talking about culture earlier, but that authentic connection, that genuine engagement transcends racial categories. When we have that engagement piece, we are certainly able to move things and help our families or individuals make different shifts based upon that connection, lending to that across racial categories. I like that. I came across this very interestingly. Rather than saying, as professionals, rather than saying, what will keep this teen in my chair? What will keep this teen here for 60 minutes or 30 minutes? Or I don't know what to talk to this teen about because they're slumped over, they're on their phone, they're not really paying attention, right? We've all experienced that. We've worked with teens or we desire to work with teens. That comes with the territory. But let's change the question. Let's ask ourselves, what will keep this teen coming back? Not what keeps this teen here, but what can we do to create a different, authentic experience with an adult that keeps the teen wanting to come back? That intervention or that activity I like to do when I work with families and individuals is called Bring It In. And that's simply what it is. I ask the teen to bring in a tangible object that represents a great value to them. Now, keeping safety into context, right? Like we will need to take that in context. They can do a reel, a TikTok, take a picture of whatever it is if they can't physically bring it in, but we want to bring that in. Have them bring in an object that's important to them, the family bring in an object, I bring in an object, and that's just a jumping point of this is important to you, this is important to me, let's talk about it. That's a really easy intervention to do when you're first starting with the family to, again, build a relationship and a connection. We're going to move forward in our conversation or presentation. Again, thank you all for hanging with us. To talk about additional models of adolescence. My colleagues mentioned a few earlier in those anxiety, depression, and the behavioral. I want to bring in these two. SAFE, that's a particularly family-centered, strength-based program for African-American teens, 14 to 16, that works on emphasizing that transition and the support between again, that middle stage of not yet a child or not longer a child and an adolescent. I really like this program because it talks exactly to what Erikson was talking about, that it promotes the critical formation of teens and their self-confidence and building their identities with their peers. And there's a portion of this model that brings in the parents so that they're doing parent stuff together, teen stuff together, and then they bring them both together. This is a 7-week program that I support in how to, again, work with family-based, non-mainstream modalities that we may think of how to work with families and adolescents. And then again, we talked about home. So that school piece, right? The 2 environments that our teens are in, it's the school, working on what works. The WOW model that was established by the solution-focused founder, Insu Kim Berg, and she created this classroom management to observing the whole classroom. And again, this model is a practical tool to help everyday problems subside in the classroom by building relationships between teens and their teachers. So these 2 models are additional approaches that I wanted to just introduce today, in addition to the other models that my colleagues spoke to about how to address and meet our teen where they are, both in that home setting and in our school setting, closing the gap to provide really culturally appropriate care for our adolescents and our teens. And I just want to end, family work is very important. It's part of the process. Youth work is family work, like my colleague said earlier. Awesome, thank you. Next slide. Self of the therapist. We've heard this before. This is our last piece as we conclude this afternoon. Self of the therapist. Self of the therapist, therapist of the self. That's how I understand it. Self of the therapist. We know that we are an instrumental tool to facilitating and kind of orientating in the room. And so using ourselves and making sure ourselves are well, because we know what burnout can do. We know what burnout looks like for us. And being able to effectively use ourselves in the room requires ourselves to be alert of our own self and our own kind of gradation of where we're feeling to be able to provide, again, quality care to our clients and the youth sitting in front of us. And on the other side of that, that's therapist of the self. We talk a lot about self-care in our field and doing things that vacations and getting our nails done or shopping or, getting a massage or doing any of those other wellness practices. That is excellent. That is excellent. But what I want to introduce this afternoon is self-love with the capital L. Whether you're left-handed or you're right-handed, do in your space the capital L, top, bottom, out. If you draw the letter L, it goes top of the L, down to self, out to others. Once you are connected with yourself, whether that be your intuition, the universe, the God of your understanding, your higher power, your creator, once that is intact, and you know truly who you are and the things that trigger you, your own emotional wounds, the things that come up for you in your own personal life outside of being a therapist or a clinician or a service provider, you can then offer and lend that same experience of peace and patience and understanding, forgiveness, communication, all of that, problem solving, conflict management to your clients outwardly. So ensuring that this line is solid and intact for yourself, and then you're able to extend it out to other people in the work that we do. And then that community of care. There's a quote by Emily and Amelia Nagoski that says, the cure for burnout isn't and can't be self-care. Self-care requires a bubble of protection of other people who value your well-being at least as highly as you do. The cure for burnout is all of us caring for each other, staying human, as we used to say in my graduate program, staying human for who you are as you do this work, because it is heavy work. We've talked about it throughout this afternoon, and the conversations will continue to go. So I thank you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to end with one more quote, but again, on behalf of myself, Jason, and Jessica, we thank you all for being here, for serving our youth, for the desired population that we want to continue to help our not future leaders, our current leaders. So we're going to leave with the quote. This touches on both the engagement piece as well as community and the importance of family work. African proverb: a child that is not embraced by the community will burn it down to feel its warmth. Embraced. That's the genuine engagement with the folks in the room, to be embraced, to be seen, to be validated, to be heard, to be understood by the community. That's the school, that's the family piece. If those are not intact, a youth may burn it down to feel its warmth. So it's a little heavy, but it's the truth of the matter, and really emphasizes the importance of youth work being family work and why we are so passionate about what we do. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us tonight and this afternoon, and I'm gonna hand it back over to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was incredible. And I know that folks may need to hop off. We just had too much amazing content to squeeze it all into an hour and a half. So I'm not sure. I know Jessica may be able to stay a little bit after. Not sure about you, Elena and Jason. But if you're welcome to reach out to them for questions, or feel free to put more questions in the chat and we can try to get back to you. Or if you have a question for Jessica, I know she's able to stay a little bit longer. And so we would love to answer as many questions as possible and know that there's always more content than we have time for. So I think unless there are any other questions or any thoughts, feel free to use the raise hand function or pop them in the chat as well. I will certainly hang out for a little bit longer if need be.
And I threw my email in the chat there for those of you who have had questions about reaching out. So feel free to email with anything. We're happy to help and be responsive. If anybody has any quick questions, happy to try and answer, but I also understand if you all need to get on with your day.
Lots of folks engaging in the stage training. And I will say for those still here, we have part 4 of this webinar series, our final part next week on Wednesday, December 14th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. And that's really focused on complex situations when providing family-based care. So we hope to see you all there as well. Yeah.
There was a question about the slides. I think you said you will be, are you distributing them? I just want to make sure I answer that correctly.
Yes, Michael, we will be able to share the slide deck. And it looks like we have a question from Bob.
I have a quick question. Simply, do we, looks like I'm blurred out, but anyway, if we missed part 2, got sick, is there a way, is there like a recording that we can still do that, get credit, get the content?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will share our website where you can actually watch all of our webinars are uploaded within usually a week. So you'll be able to see all 4 parts on our website, and part 2 is already uploaded. So let me grab that link for you. And then you're welcome to just email us and then ask us for the certificate once you've watched it.
Fantastic. Thank you.